When the sky closed its mouth and the voice of God was hidden among the clouds, there was a man on earth who among ashes and wounds he did not cease to worship. His name was Job, and his faith shook the heavens. The golden light of dawn envelops the hills of us. The wind caresses the fields brimming with life, and the shepherd's song blends with the bleating of thousands of sheep. In the midst of this blessed land walks a man whose fame has spread throughout the east. His name is Job, an upright man who fears God and shuns evil, a loving father, a faithful husband, a generous servant. Prosperity surrounds him, but arrogance never touches his heart. He has 7 sons and 3 daughters, great herds, faithful servants, and an irreproachable reputation. But what truly distinguishes Job is his devotion every time his children hold a feast day after day. House after house, Job rises early, takes an unblemished lamb, he sacrifices it on the altar, and prays with a broken heart. Perhaps my children have sinned in their hearts, perhaps they have cursed God unknowingly. So Job does not pray out of fear of losing, he prays for fear of displeasing the Most High. The scene is perfect. Everything breathes peace, harmony, blessing. But while the earth celebrates, the heavens observe. High above where the children of God gather, a shadow appears. Its stride is lofty, his inquisitive eyes. It is Satan the accuser, and God asks him, "Where do you come from?" Roaming the earth and walking around it, he answers coldly. Then the Creator pronounces a name that shakes the kingdom of darkness. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth." Silence, and suddenly the question that will change history by chance. Job honors you without expecting anything in return. Satan challenges, "Touch him, take everything he has, and you will see if he doesn't curse you to your face." And God allows the trial, not because he doubts Job, but because he trusts him. The decree was sealed in heaven, but on earth everything remains the same. Job rises as always, prays as always, loves as always, not as always. But that day, unknowingly, will be your darkest day. There are no lightning bolts. There are no warnings, just one. Sky silent, silence, the invisible battle has begun, and now the heart of the spectator is also confronted. Can a man remain faithful? When he lost everything, there was a man in the land of Uz, whose name resonated with respect and awe. Job. His reputation did not come from gold or achievements, but from something much rarer and more valuable: integrity. Job was perfect and blameless, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. His life was not just blessed, he was exemplary. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His home was a beacon of joy, unity, and reverence in his lands. 7,000 sheep grazed 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 jennies, and a multitude of servants who served under his just leadership throughout the East. There was no man greater than him, but what truly made Job a giant, it was not his wealth, it was his heart. His children held feasts in their homes, one after another, in a cycle of brotherhood that delighted the Father. But upon concluding each round of feasts, Job would rise early and offer burnt offerings for each of his children. 10 offerings, 10 intercessions in case, in their joy, any of them had sinned in their hearts. "Perhaps my children have sinned by cursing God in their thoughts," Job whispered as the smoke of the sacrifice rose to the sky. It was not fear, it was reverence, a heart that did not fear losing the material but to offend the eternal. That was his constant routine. Worship not only in abundance but in spiritual vigilance. He was a man who loved God. More than the blessings, his faith did not depend on what he possessed, but on whom he belonged to. But while the earth was filled with harmony, the heavens were preparing for a moment that would change history. One day the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord, celestial ministering angels. They entered before the Majesty with reverence, and among them appeared one who no longer revered one whose fall had filled the heavens with darkness and the earth with deceit. Satan and God spoke directly to him. "Where do you come from?" The adversary replied with disdain. "To roam the earth and walk on it?" Then the Creator pronounced a name that would shake the heavens and would provoke hell. "Have you observed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, and a perfect and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil." The divine declaration was not just a compliment. It was a revelation Job was not a casual worshiper. It was a living proof that even in a fallen world a man could walk in integrity, but the enemy did not surrender by chance. He feared God for nothing you did not surround him, his house, and everything he has you blessed the work of his hands and his livestock multiplied on the land. But stretch out your hand, touch everything he has, and see if he doesn't curse you to your face. The challenge was thrown not against Job, but against the essence of faith. Is it possible to love God without receiving anything in return? Can a heart remain faithful when everything is lost? And God entrusted everything he has into your hands. Just do not stretch out your hand against him, and Satan departed on the earth. The sky remained silent. There were no lightning strikes, no warning, rain fell. Job awoke as on any other day, walked among his flocks, supervised his servants, prayed, offered the Holocaust as always. Nothing in his world had changed yet, but heaven had already spoken, and hell had already mobilized. What neither Job nor his children knew was that his faith would be placed on an eternal scale, not before the eyes of men, but before God himself and his angels. Job was the most righteous of all men, and for that reason he would be tested, not because he had failed, not because he deserved punishment, but because his faith was true and God knew he would endure. Thus begins the story of a man whose life was perfect until heaven fell silent and hell unleashed its fury. But even when pain approaches, when loss invades, when friends abandon him, and the body falls apart, Job will teach the world that true faith does not need explanations. It only needs of God. It was a morning like any other in Job's house. The sun rose over the hills of Uz, and the fields still breathed the peace of a blessed land. The servants worked in the stables, the flocks grazed in the valleys, and in the distance, the laughter of Job's children filled the air. Once again they gathered to celebrate united as always, but in the invisible. Something was moving in the heavens. God's silence did not mean absence, but trial. And on the earth, the shadows began to advance suddenly. A messenger arrived, running with a face covered in dust and breathless. His eyes showed something beyond urgency. They showed a horror. Lord Job, the Sabaeans fell upon the oxen, and the donkeys killed your servants with the sword. Only I escaped to bring you the news before Job could respond. Another messenger arrived, even more agitated. God's fire fell from the sky, consumed the sheep and the shepherds with them. Only I escaped. The words had not yet finished when another man appeared in the distance, staggering. Covered in sweat, the Chaldeans formed 3 squads. They attacked your camels, killed the servants. Only I escaped to tell you Job did not understand. His lips remained closed, but his eyes sought the sky. Why? Why now? Then the 4th messenger arrived. His legs trembled. His voice was a broken whisper, and his words were like a blade that shattered the soul of the most upright man in the East. Your children were eating and drinking wine in the house of the eldest brother, and suddenly a great wind came from the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and the house collapsed on them, and they all died. Only I escaped. Time stopped. The world of Job crumbled. There were no servants left, no animals left, no wealth left, and the most painful of all, there were no children left. 10 lives buried in an instant, 10 names torn from a father's heart. The dust filled the air. The echo of the servants' cries mingled with the stunned silence of the empty fields. Job tore his robe, fell to his knees on the ground, and shaved his head as a symbol of mourning. But what he did next would shake the heavens. Job worshipped, yes. He worshipped from the dust, from the wound. From the abyss of pain, with a broken voice and a shattered soul, Job pronounced words that will be written for eternity. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord took away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. No blasphemy came from his mouth, no complaint against God. Only worship. The earth fell silent, the sky too. But hell trembled, because the one who had been accused worshipped. The one who had lost everything did not blaspheme. The one who was mourning still loved. The hours passed. The night fell. The house lights were off. Dust still floated in the air, and in Job's heart there remained only one certainty: God had not spoken, but he still believed. Most of the world would never know what happened that day. No one would understand how a single day could destroy a life and reveal a faith. That day was not by chance. It was decree that day. It was not punishment, it was a test. And Job, though wounded, had been defeated. The earth still mourned, the ashes of the sacrifice, mingled with those of lamentation, the voices that once sang in Job's house were now hushed whispers of servants who did not know how to comfort the man who had lost everything. But even so, Job did not sin. Satan was not satisfied. His accusation still stood. Once again, the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord, and once again the adversary and the Most High also came with the same firmness. He asked again, "Where do you come from?" Satan answered, "From roaming throughout the earth and going back and forth in it." Then God spoke again about the man whose faith had shaken the heavens. "Have you considered my servant Job still maintains his integrity despite your inciting me against him to ruin him without cause?" But the cunning Satan did not give up skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But now stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and see if he will not curse you to your face. And God allowed it once again. He is in your hands. Just spare him his life. The day dawned with a strange silence. Job got up as usual, but his body was trembling. At first it was a light itch, then burning spots began to appear on his skin. Then wounds, then open sores filled with pus covering every inch of his flesh. There was no doctor, there was no relief, no balm, no ointment. The pain was continuous and brutal. The flies landed on the wounds. The sun burned his wounded skin. The nights were cold and endless. Job sat on a pile of ashes, no longer in his house, but on the outskirts of the city. Like the unclean, he took a piece of broken pottery and with it began to scrape his flesh, for the pain was unbearable. The most upright man in the East was now becoming the most despised. Then came the voice he least expected. It was not that of an enemy, it was his wife's voice, the woman who had shared with him the days of prosperity. Now she could no longer bear the ruin. Her voice no longer had tenderness, only anger. His face showed no compassion but disgust, and his words were a direct blow to the heart. "You still preserve your integrity, curse God, and die a brutal sentence, an invitation to give up." A temptation dressed in despair. But Job did not give in with a weak but firm voice. He responded as any foolish woman would, "Thus you speak. We will receive from God only good and not also evil." It was not a theological statement. It was a confession of faith. Job did not understand what was happening. Didn't know he was being observed, had no explanation, but had a conviction God continued to be trustworthy. And in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. The dust covered him. His body was an open wound, his breath a lament. But his soul remained steadfast. Outside, the people murmured, "What could Job have done to deserve this?" His name, once synonymous with honor, now it was synonymous with judgment, and yet Job did not justify himself. Day after day, night after night, the pain continued. There was no cure. There were no words. There was no sleep. The sky remained silent. This was the deepest wound of all, not the flesh, not the loss, but the silence of the one he loved the most. Where was God? Why was he silent? Why didn't he respond? But even in the midst of this abyss, Job did not blaspheme because his faith was not based on answers, but in relation to physical pain. It had reached its peak. His body was unrecognizable. His soul was weary but still in the ashes among ruins and pus, with a trembling voice and a bleeding heart. Job remained faithful. He had no idea what was to come. He didn't know that heaven was watching him with pride, did not know that hell had been humiliated by his perseverance. But this ignorance did not prevent him from worshiping in the darkest corners of human existence, where logic breaks down, where prayers seem to hit the sky. Job's faith burned, like a weak flame, but unquenchable. This was the most intimate test, not losing things, not losing people, but losing control and continuing to trust. This was the faith that defeated the darkness. The dust remained suspended in the air. The wounds did not heal. The sky remained closed, and Job, immersed in the abyss of pain, seemed forgotten by everyone except for three men who, upon hearing what had happened, decided to travel long distances to console his friend. He shows great kindness and compassion. Isophar of Naamati, wise men, respected elders, knowledgeable of traditions and the paths of the patriarchs. They began the journey with a single purpose: accompany Job in his misery, comfort him in his pain, offer him words of solace while he faced what no man had endured before. When they arrived and lifted their eyes from afar, they could not recognize him, that once proud man, prosperous and firm. He had become a disfigured shadow, sitting on a mound of ash covered in wounds, with torn skin and a lost gaze, as if life had abandoned him without a farewell. Then they tore their robes, threw dust on their heads, and sat down beside him for 7 days and 7 nights, without uttering a single word, because they saw that his pain was too great to be touched by human voice. That shared silence was not empty. It was reverence. It was the recognition that there are pains that cannot be explained. There are wounds that do not admit speeches. There are mourning periods that can only be accompanied by presence. But on the 8th day, when the sun rose again over us, and the desert breeze had not yet brought comfort, Job opened his lips not to blaspheme against God, but to curse the day of his birth, expressing with broken words the abyss that consumed him, wishing he had never seen the light, wishing that day had been erased from the calendar of the sky, wishing that the gates of hell had never opened for him. His cry was not against God. It was against his existence, because light is given to the troubled and life to the man embittered in soul who awaits death, and it does not come, who seeks it more than treasures. Job did not ask for an explanation. He asked for relief. He did not demand justice. He implored for rest. Did not renounce faith, just struggled to breathe. But instead of solace found judgment. The first to speak was he, making the temenit. The oldest in the Kujutan group was serene but laden with assumptions. He reminded Job that according to tradition, those who sow iniquity reap affliction. He insinuated that no innocent person perishes, that the experience of the wise shows that punishment does not come without reason. Although his words were organized, they carried poison disguised as pity. Job, if you are suffering so much, it is because you did something wrong. Then said Bildad the Shuhite, who was more direct, almost cruel. If your children have died, he said without trembling his voice, it was because they sinned, and God, who does not twist justice, he gave them what they deserved. But if you are just, then seek God, and perhaps he will restore you with coldness. He defended tradition, placing the law above lament, logic above compassion. Then Zophar the Naamathite, the most impetuous, the most severe, he rose with words as harsh as stones, declaring that Job was not only guilty, but that he deserved an even greater punishment, as his suffering was little compared to his hidden sin, and that if he truly humbled himself, perhaps God would have mercy with each speech. Job listened with a broken heart, not only because of the content, but because those who had come to console now became accusers, judges sitting over the ruins of his life, launching arguments like arrows over a body already wounded. Then Job responded not with wrath, but with pain. You are all troublesome comforters. Do I not have the right to lament what happens to me? Where is the compassion? Where is the empathy? Job defended his integrity without arrogance, and in doing so, he became a mirror for so many who suffer and do not find compassion in those who should offer it. He did not cry out for a defense before men, but for an audience with God, for only he knew his heart. Only he could testify that Job was not perfect, but he was faithful, and through tears, Job said a phrase that would transcend the centuries-worn declaration that was not an answer, but a living hope. I know that my Redeemer lives, and finally, he will rise upon the dust, and after my skin has been consumed, in my flesh I will see God. There was no explanation, no voice from heaven, no change in circumstances. But there was a certainty. Job believed that not everything would end in ashes, that even if his friends failed and even if his body disintegrated, still he would see God with his own eyes. The days continued his slow step over the ruins of Uz, and while Job's body remained covered in wounds, his soul was now attacked by words as cutting as the pain itself. The silence, that which was once sacred, had been shattered in a stream of speeches that aimed to explain everything, fit suffering into old formulas, and reduce the mystery of God to simple human causes. But Job's heart, though torn, was not willing to accept an unjust judgment, not even coming from his friends. He took the floor again, appealing to dreams and visions. Speaking in a mystical tone but without compassion, he affirmed that no mortal is just before God, nor are the angels pure in his eyes, and for this reason Job should not be surprised by his calamity. He advised him to humble himself, that he should return to God and accept the correction because he wounds but also heals. However, behind his words there was a persistent accusation. Something you did. No one suffers without reason. The wicked insisted on the infallible justice of God. He said that the Almighty does not pervert justice, that if Job's children had died, it was because they deserved judgment, and that if he turned to the Omnipotent, perhaps his justice would be restored, but his words did not bring comfort. Only weight on a soul already broken. Zophar was the harshest, speaking with authority but without empathy, accusing Job of talking too much. To justify himself without reason, he declared that Job hid malice, that his punishment was little given his guilt, and that if he only washed his hands, God would have mercy, and Job listened repeatedly. Day after day he did not defend himself out of pride, but out of despair did not seek to prove her innocence before men, but to understand why God, whom loved with all her being, had cast her into this abyss without explanation. Then Job spoke not with anger, but with the deep cry of an honest soul before the Creator. Surely you are the people, and with you wisdom. Will die, he said with irony, not in mockery, but to expose the arrogance of those who spoke as if they knew all the ways of God. Job did not deny the greatness of the Most High, did not ignore his power, but dared to ask sincerely what many silence out of fear. Why did you make me your target? Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? What is man that you observe him? Test him every morning, and examine him at every moment. There was no blasphemy in his words, but a search. There was no rebellion, but anguish, for the heart of Job did not want to understand the world. It wanted to understand God in his speeches. He defended his integrity, remembered his compassion for the poor, his justice with the servants, his fidelity at home, his constant reverence, and in doing so, he did not express pride but pain. If I pricked, show me, but if I didn't sting, why this affliction? Your friends kept accusing, insisting on old formulas. The wicked suffer, the good prosper. Too much Job challenged them with reality. The wicked often prosper. Their houses are secure, their children grow up in peace. And I who prayed every morning, that interceded for my children, that I did not take the widow as prey, that I did not deny bread to the hungry, I am destroyed without cause. And then a ray of hope emerged amidst the chaos in one of his most profound speeches. Job raised his voice and declared with a faith that defied silence, the logic, the pain, and even death. I know that my Redeemer lives, and finally he will rise upon the dust, and after my skin has been consumed in my flesh, I will see God. I will see him for myself, and my own eyes will behold him and not another. This cry was not an answer, it was a declaration, an anchor cast into the future. Job did not know how, did not know when, but knew in whom he trusted. His Redeemer lived despite the decaying flesh, despite the body covered in pus, despite the abandonment of silence and misunderstanding, despite the words that did not heal, despite everything. And while men spoke from his limited theology, Job, even in his confusion, was approaching of a truth that only brokenness reveals, that true faith is not about explanations but of relationship, and that there are moments when you don't need to be right but to remain. Job did not win the debate. His friends did not change their minds, but the heavens listened, and the judgment of men would soon be replaced by a voice that does not come from the earth but from the whirlwind. During endless days, Job had been the target of human speeches loaded with theological formulas, rigid arguments, and soulless explanations offered by those who, although they intended to console, only hurt with cold words and misguided judgments, while the true consolation remained in a mysterious silence, not out of indifference, but for a deeper purpose, yet unrevealed. And in that atmosphere of accumulated tension, when arguments could no longer fill the void, nor the reasoning heal the wounds, the voice of a young Elihu unexpectedly emerged, who until then had remained silent, not out of fear or passivity, but out of respect for the elders present, patiently waiting the moment to speak, not from tradition, but from the burning conviction that bubbled up, burned within him Elihu with an inflamed gaze and words that flowed like a river contained. He addressed both Job and his friends with a mixture of passion and reverent fear, making it clear that their intentions were not to condemn, as the others had done, but to exalt the justice of God and affirm that even in the deepest suffering, the Creator can speak, either through dreams, visions, or even through pain itself, not as punishment, but as a means to rescue the soul from the abyss and redirect the heart towards eternity. For God, according to him, does not keep silence without purpose, nor wounds without redemptive intention. And it was precisely while Elihu spoke about the greatness of the Most High, about the thunder of his voice and the mystery of his ways, that something began to change in the air, something that went beyond rhetoric, beyond human knowledge, something that could not be contained in words, for the atmosphere itself seemed to bow before the presence of the sacred. The clouds began to gather on the horizon like a celestial army preparing to descend. The winds intensified with a growing force that roared among the hills. The lightning tore through the sky like flaming swords, and the trees previously motionless began to lean under the weight of an approaching glory. And then, amidst the roar of the elements and the whirlwind that formed like a throne spinning in fire and wind, the voice was heard. It was not an ordinary voice. It was not an echo of the heart. It was the voice of God himself, a voice that did not come to explain, but to reveal, a voice that did not come down to justify what had happened, but to expose the smallness of human understanding in the face of the immensity of the one who sustains the foundations of the universe. Then who is this that darkens counsel with words without knowledge? The Eternal shouted, and with that single phrase, all the previous conversation was reduced to dust, because all human speeches fell silent, and Job, the broken but upright man, he covered his face because he understood that he had spoken too much, without knowing God did not start by talking about justice, did not mention Job's suffering, because he did not answer any of his questions. Instead, he led him on a journey of contemplation through the wonders of creation, through the mysteries of the universe, through the paths of the constellations, the boundaries of the sea, the rain that falls without human intervention, the birth of young ones in the heights of the mountains, the roar of the lions, and the majestic flight of the falcon, as if to say, look at what I have done and tell me if you can understand even a small part of what I sustain with my word. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, if you know, or who stretched the line across it? Each question did not demand an answer. It demanded surrender, because before the greatness of the Creator God, the complaints of the human heart become humble sighs, not because the pain doesn't matter, but because in the presence of the one who sees and knows everything, even the deepest suffering finds its place within a greater plan, a plan that, although incomprehensible at the moment, is guided by eternal hands that never lose control. Someone who had wished to speak face to face with God, who had requested an audience as an accused before the judge, now found himself in the presence and understood that the judge was also a father, that the Creator was also a redeemer, and that his silence had not been absence, but waiting, and with a broken soul, but now full of light. Job responded not with accusations or petitions, but with adoration. I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me that I didn't know. With my ears I knew you, but now my eyes see you. No further explanations were needed. Seeing God was enough, because more than answers, Job had received revelation, and in that revelation, his pain did not disappear, but was transformed. He was no longer a broken man in search of justice. He was a surrendered servant who, even in the ashes, he had seen the glory of the invisible after the storm. When the voice fell silent and the whirlwind dissipated over the devastated land of Uz, reigned a different silence. It was no longer the silence of abandonment nor of judgment, but the peace that follows a revelation, the profound and sacred silence that remains in the heart of one who has seen God face to face and understood that even among unanswered questions there is a certainty that transforms everything. God remains good even when life doesn't seem like it. God continues to be just even when pain says otherwise, and God remains present, even when he hides among the clouds for a time. Job had not received explanations either about the loss of his children, or about the destruction of his possessions, nor about the disease that consumed his flesh, but he had received something infinitely more precious. The glorious vision of the eternal, this intimate and tremendous experience that breaks logic and crushes pride, but also reconstructs the soul and plants a faith that no longer depends on circumstances, but from the relationship. A faith that does not ask for signs because it was sealed by the very presence of God, and it was then that Job humbled himself before the Most High and confessed his ignorance with trembling. Lips more sincere than God himself now, not from the whirlwind, but from his throne of justice. He addressed Job's friends, those who, in trying to explain suffering, had misrepresented the divine character they had spoken of God without knowledge, and had placed even more weight on the one already broken, the voice of a man already broken by the trial. God rebuked him. He makes humility and Zophar with words that cut like a sword. My anger was kindled against you because you did not speak of me what was right, like my servant Job. And with this declaration, heaven restored Job's honor before men, made it clear that integrity is not in having all the answers, but in remaining faithful even without having any, and that the contrite heart that surrenders but does not reveal itself is more precious than all human theology. The judgment of God was not released as an immediate punishment, but it came accompanied by mercy, a mercy that required a concrete action. The three friends were to bring 7 bulls and 7 rams and present them before Job so that he would intercede for them. Yes, that man covered in scars, the one who had been accused, questioned, and judged, would now be the priest who would place himself between them and divine judgment, interceding for those who did not understand him, praying for those who hurt him with words, forgiving those who did not know how to be with him when he needed it most needed. And Job prayed not out of resentment, not out of superiority, but out of compassion, born from the brokenness for a grace that only one experiences, who was sustained by the hand of God in the darkness. And when Job prayed for his friends, the heavens moved not by magic, not by merit, but because true restoration begins when the wounded heart chooses forgiveness over revenge, when what was broken offers itself as bridge of redemption for those who broke it. Then says the sacred account that the Lord restored Job's fortune, and not only restored it, but gave him double what he had before. Where there was once loss, now there was multiplication. Where there was mourning, now life blossomed. The flocks returned, but in greater numbers. The fields flourished again. But with more abundance the servants returned to fill the house, but with more honor and with the years. God granted him children again, 7 men and 3 women, but this time his daughters received a rare place in those times. An inheritance among the brothers, a gesture of justice, honor, and love that showed how much Job's heart had changed, not because of the pain, but because of the glory he saw amidst the pain. And the names of his daughters were a living poetry. Jemima, which means dove, Kezia, which evokes the sweetness of perfume, and they want Rapuk, which means ink bottle, a symbol of beauty and grace. They were not just names. They were testimonies that bitterness did not prevail, that hope could still blossom after the loss it had already lived through after all that 140 years, and saw his children and his children's children, to the 4th generation, as if God himself were telling him not. Everything has ended in dust. There is still life. There is still promise. And when his time finally came, died old and full of days, but more than full of days, full of glory, because true glory is not in not suffering. The true glory lies in knowing God in the midst of suffering, worshiping him when everything is gone to remain, faithful even when the sky falls silent, and in the end discover that sky never far away when the dust finally settled over the ashes of Uz and the echo of unanswered questions. Dissipated on the horizon of time, what remained was not a story of loss, not even a story of suffering, but a story of revelation, the story of a man who, having lost everything, chose to continue trusting, not because he understood, not because he had guarantees of restitution, but because the soul had been shaped by a truth higher than circumstances, that the God he worshipped did not deserve loyalty for what he gave, but for who he was. Job is not remembered simply because he suffered, nor because he endured with stoicism the most intense afflictions a man can endure. Job is remembered because In the midst of the most absolute darkness, when there was no voice, no signs, no human comfort, he decided to continue worshiping in the silence of God. In the apparent abandonment, in the open wound that bled day after day without any explanation, Job did not deny his faith, he transformed it. He moved from a faith based on what he knew to a faith based on who he knew went from tradition to intimacy after hearing about it upon seeing, and this vision, this encounter with the eternal, was enough to restore his soul even before his body was healed. Even before his possessions were restored, even before his children were given back to him by God, because the greatest miracle of his history, it was not the double portion, it was the transformation of his spirit. It was the brokenness that became worship. It was the wound that became an altar. It was the ash that became glory. The secret of Job is not in his resistance. It is in his surrender. It was not his strength that sustained him. It was his humility. It was not his knowledge that saved him. It was his reverence, and it was that reverence that God exalted, not because Job was perfect, but because he was truthful, because he dared to ask without blaspheming, because he dared to cry without cursing, because he dared to wait without any visible promise, because even when everything seemed lost, Job did not stop believing that behind the silence there was a God who saw, who counted every tear, who heard every sigh, and that in his time would reveal. The story of Job does not give us easy answers to the mystery of human pain, does not offer formulas or quick solutions, does not promise that all who suffer will be restored in the same way, but offers an eternal truth that pain is not the end, that the silence of God does not mean absence, that the trial does not nullify the purpose, and that heaven, even though it may seem silent, is always acting even in the darkest night of the soul. And that is why Job, the upright man of the East, becomes a mirror for all those who today go through storms without explanation, senseless losses, illnesses that defy logic, betrayals that break the heart, silences that hurt more than 1,000 words to all of them. Job whispers from the eternal pages of the divine account, "You are not alone. I also went through this. I also cried out to the heavens. I also tore my garments, but in the end I heard. In the end, he spoke to me. In the end, it was worth it." And this is the climax of this story. Not that Job was restored, but that he was transformed, because after seeing everything burn, after feeling every blow, after being accused, misunderstood, and abandoned, Job was not only a witness to God's faithfulness, he became a living testimony of it over the centuries. His story has been read, sung, preached, cried. It has been light for those who walk in shadows, has been a refuge for those who do not find answers today, has been a beacon for those who face storms. And today, it continues to be an invitation to trust not in what we feel, not in what we see, not in what we understand, but in the one who is above all understanding, an invitation to keep the faith even when the sky is silent, an invitation to declare, as he declared, even with the flesh full of wounds, even sitting on ashes, the Lord gave, the Lord took away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And further on, when the soul can no longer bear the weight of the mystery, and the heart cries out for a certainty to sustain it, repeat his eternal words, those that do not come from the mind but from the spirit that has been touched by God. I know that my Redeemer lives, yes, because he lives. Even if he doesn't speak, even if he doesn't heal, even if he doesn't explain, even so, he lives. Even if he doesn't explain, yet he lives. And one day, just like with Job, he will rise upon the dust of our ruins, and he will show us that it was not in vain that every tear was counted, that every wound will be restored, and that each silence was part of an eternal plan that you too may one day say, with a soul full of scars, but with eyes opened by faith from hearing about you. I knew you, but now my eyes see you. Portuguese, Brazil.